The Roaring Twenties was a period in history of dramatic social and political change. For the first time, more Americans lived in cities than on farms. The nation's total wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 1929, and this economic growth swept many Americans into an affluent but unfamiliar consumer society. People from coast to coast bought the same goods thanks to nationwide advertising and the spread of chain stores, listened to the same music, did the same dances, and even used the same slang. Many Americans were uncomfortable with this new urban, sometimes racy mass culture. In fact, for many, even most, people in the United States, the 1920s brought more conflict than celebration. However, for a small handful of young people in the nation's big cities, the 1920s were roaring indeed. The end of World War I brought Americans back into an isolationist mood. The public, who was excited to go to Europe to fight the war to end all wars, was unhappy with the results of the war. Public sentiment favored pulling away from world affairs, focusing more on domestic issues that needed to be addressed now that the war was over. When the war ended, inflation rose to 15%, causing prices to soar. With the wartime jobs disappearing, unemployment went up as well. As prices rose, wages didn't keep up. Labor unions and worker dissatisfaction led to over 3,000 strikes by over 4,000 workers across the country. These strikes contributed to an overall fear of labor unions as possible communist threats from Europe. European countries were drowning in debt and had to rebuild much of its industrial sectors. The United States became a major supplier of goods to European countries as they began their industrial reconstruction. Republican presidents will also use high tariffs to protect American businesses and low taxes to encourage investment in those businesses. American manufacturers used Taylorism or scientific management, as well as Henry Ford's moving assembly line, to make the production of goods more efficient and drive down prices. This led to the mass production of new products, such as the automobile, the radio, and other electrical appliances. New appliances like the vacuum and the washing machine gave women more leisure time to pursue other interests. With more leisure time, Americans fell in love with the movies. Early movies were silent with subtitles. The addition of sound to motion pictures in 1927 with the first feature-length talkie, called The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson, created nationwide excitement. With the introduction of movies with sound, weekly attendance went from 40 million in 1922 to over 100 million by 1930. There were over 30,000 movie theaters in the United States by the end of the 1920s. Mass production techniques led to an increase in the production of household appliances. This began an age of consumerism. Advertising like the one seen here and the installment plan led to consumer culture. Buying on installment plans let Americans purchase expensive goods by making small payments over time. Newly elected President Warren G. Harding wanted what he called a return to normalcy. Unfortunately, this meant a return to the policies during the Gilded Age for business. He was a very pro-business president. His policies led to some of the scandals that rocked his presidency, which helped label him as one of the worst presidents in history. A president's cabinet is made up of his closest advisors, his Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Treasury Secretary, etc. This is President Harding's cabinet. The problem is that he gave these jobs to his poker buddies. Most of them were from his home state of Ohio, so they were known as the Ohio Gang. His corrupt friends used their political positions to become wealthy. One of his policies was to pass the Forney-McCumber tariff. Remember that a tariff is a tax on imported goods. This tariff raised taxes on imports to about 60%, the highest level ever. So let's take a look at an example. For example, the price of a radio is $10. If that radio was imported from England, it would have a tax of $6 to raise the price to $16 total. The same exact radio here in the United States would of course cost the $10. So which one would you buy? The English radio for $16 or the American radio for $10? Obviously you would pick the American radio. That's what happened. Americans stopped buying foreign products. There's another problem. France and England owe the United States $10 billion for World War I loans. Because of the high tariff, they can't pay back their loans. So they go to Germany, who of course owes them money as a punishment for starting World War I. Germany can't pay for many reasons. Number one, the Treaty of Versailles took away its colonies, so they can't make any money off of them. And secondly, They had sky-high inflation. So to stop this, the United States loaned Germany money. Germany then uses that money to pay off France and England. France and England then, of course, take that money and give it back to the United States. The biggest scandal of the Harding presidency was called the Teapot Dome scandal. Teapot Dome was a place in Wyoming that the government owned. The Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, illegally leased this land to an oil company and pocketed $400,000 for himself in return for allowing them to use the land. He was found guilty of bribery and became the first American to be convicted of a felony while holding a cabinet position. In early 1923, just before the Teapot Dome scandal went public, Harding went on a nationwide tour. On August 2nd, he died suddenly of congestive heart failure. His vice president, Calvin Coolidge, would serve out the remainder of his term and would be elected to his own term. President Coolidge fit right in with the pro-business spirit of the 1920s. He said, "The chief business of the American people is business." His goal was to keep government interference in business to a minimum and allow private enterprise to flourish. One of his policies was to give businesses more available credit to expand. This would prove to be a very important point at the end of the decade. In 1924, Congress passed the Native American Citizenship Act. It granted full U.S. citizenship to America's indigenous peoples. Under the 1924 Act, American Indians did not have to apply for citizenship, nor did they have to give up their tribal citizenship in order to become a U.S. citizen. Most tribes had communal property, and in order to have right to the land, Indians must belong to the tribe, thus dual citizenship was allowed. Not all states complied with the law. All Native Americans weren't allowed to vote until 1948. One perceived threat to American life was communism. This is a government that controls every aspect of their citizens' lives. Under communism, one political party rules the government. A dictator from that party runs the country. The government then controls both the economic and political system. Russia is where communism got its big start. It began with Germans Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, but it did not take hold until Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin started the Second Revolution in Russia in 1917. Once in power, they negotiated a treaty with Germany and got out of World War I. They cried out for a worldwide workers' revolution to abolish or get rid of capitalism everywhere. They raised their red flag, which is why they're called Reds. When a communist group formed in the US, the public and the government overreacted and created what we call the Red Scare. This was a time period when the country was paranoid that communists were going to take over the government. The Red Scare was caused by three factors. One, the Bolshevik or Second Russian Revolution, where communist revolutionaries took over Russia. Two, the influx of immigrants coming into the United States before World War I. And three, the large number of labor disputes and strikes led by socialists after World War I. This paranoia led to the next incident. A series of unexplained bombings caused Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer to establish a special office under J. Edgar Hoover to gather information on radicals. Palmer also ordered mass arrests of anarchists, socialists, and labor agitators. From November 1919 through January 1920, over 6,000 people were arrested based on limited criminal evidence. Most of the suspects were foreign-born, and 500 of them, including the outspoken Emma Goldman, were deported. The Red Scare faded almost as quickly as it arose. Palmer warned of huge riots on May Day 1920, but they never took place. His loss of credibility, coupled with rising concerns about civil liberties, caused the hysteria to recede, but it did lead to a rise in xenophobia, or the fear of foreign-born people, as well as nativism, favoring those Americans that were born here. Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were Italian immigrants who were convicted in a Massachusetts court of committing robbery and murder in 1921. Liberals protested that the two men were innocent, and that they had been accused, convicted, and sentenced to die simply because they were poor Italians and anarchists. Remember that anarchists are people who are against all forms of government. After 6 years of appeals and national and international debates over the fairness of their trial, Sacco and Vanzetti were executed in 1927.